Hi, this is AD Burrows here for CG Masters. This will be the first in a series of videos and posts detailing the progress of this game development project. I'll be sharing any stumbling blocks and workarounds I come across and putting out hopefully what you'll find to be helpful tips and tutorials in the process. At the end of the video, I'll also be adding a quick bonus section which will show how to get an asset like, like this bridge that's over here from the asset pack. You can see it's just a standalone bridge like that at the moment, just meant to be seen from below. A little bit over here, you can see I've actually got this to tile several times. It's curved round and it's kind of in the background there of this particular street scene that you can see at the moment. So we'll be just taking a look at that just at the end. So first we'll look at some useful advantages of using Blender at this stage, this early kind of prototyping stage really, and 5 things to help get set up really fast. There's nothing quite so likely to dampen the creative spark than running into hurdles because of the tech or having to do lengthy setups. So it can be pretty useful to be able to iterate and prototype out ideas pretty quickly. Luckily for us, this happens to be one of Blender's strengths due to its versatility. So right now I'd like to use these assets to make a survival style 3D game. Let me just first talk very briefly about the premise of the game. The gameplay will be almost ludicrously simple in this first iteration. I've got a few ideas for the next iteration that should allow for a bit more depth and a bit more novelty in the game, but for now the premise is Alien Isolation meets Pac-Man set in Manchester. And so if that sounds a bit bizarre, let me explain. The Alien Isolation reference is simply that there's one main enemy in pursuit of you throughout the level. The enemy is faster than you, so if it sees you, there's a slim but not impossible chance of you being able to evade it. Put another way, keep your eyes and ears open, as the most likely strategy for success is just to evade it. The Pac-Man reference is to do with the collection aspect while being pursued. Once you've collected everything, and if you're still alive, then you've beat the game. A lot of the street layout will be based on some interesting looking areas of Manchester, so hopefully that explains that. As a brief aside, let me just show you how I went about creating this low-res kind of 8-bit styled Pac-Man here. I'm just going to move that off to the side. We should be able to do this pretty quickly in under a minute, I would have thought. So if you just go Shift A to add a mesh circle, we've got no face on that circle, so let's just press tab into edit mode and then press F to fill it to create that face. The face is already selected now, and we can just go Alt P to poke the face, which just places a vertex at the center of the face and then connects them all up to the peripheral vertices with edges, as you can see here. Now to create the mouth of the Pac-Man, we just need to get rid of about, say, those, and then so select those faces, press X to delete the faces, and then I'm just going to select all the faces with the A key and then press E to extrude up a little bit, and then tab back into object mode, as that is pretty much it. At least if you're not going to go for the 8-bit style. Let's just place the material on there. It's just a simple material which is kind of this golden yellowy orangey color, and then what we can do is to give it the 8-bit look, we can come over to our modifiers and just place a remesh modifier, which is a blocks type. And now here, based on the octree depth, you can make it look more a higher resolution or lower resolution, and go really low if you like. And you've also got the scale to just fine-tune the placement of that there. So that's basically how I went about creating that. Just thought that might be a useful aside for somebody. Now, admittedly, I have actually tried out a few gameplay and enemy AI options already and tweaked the idea quite a bit to get it even to this very early stage. I'll come back to this in a future post though. At this point of the development, there's usually lots of scraps of paper and notes here, there and everywhere. However, I'll try and present this in a more useful and easier to digest form and order. This is why I've just picked these few points to raise right now, just to introduce the whole thing to you, but pretty soon we'll be looking at the game design document, where all the finer details of the game and the gameplay will be brought together. So I think that in this kind of game, something that is pretty common to enhance atmosphere is the inclusion of fog or mist. In this case, I'd like to really push the fog to be quite extreme. So this brings us to the first of the 5 things to help us get set up quickly, which is the fog. Now, fog is pretty easy to set up in Blender, as we've got real-time viewport mist. Right now I have the 3D view maximized, so I'm just going to press Shift Space to unmaximize it so that we can get access to our other windows in this particular screen layout. And that's important because we need to get access to our properties window, in particular the World tab, which you can see up here, and that's because the mist setting is right at the bottom of that panel in this case, and you can see that the checkbox is enabled and we can see mist in our 3D view. And just to really make that obvious, if I just kind of zoom out there, you can see more and more of it getting occluded by the mist there. Basically all that's happening is it's essentially the further something is away, the more it's getting blended into this particular mist color. And where do we find this mist color? Where do we set that? Well, that's just at the top here under the horizon area. We don't need any of these other world sections to be enabled. We just need to set the horizon color, and that will be our mist color. And just going through quickly through these settings, the minimum here that we've got is, as you can see on the tooltip there, is the overall minimum intensity of the mist effect, which means at the moment it starts 2 blender units away from the camera, and then it's about 50 blender units where it fades into full intensity. So an object at 50 units away is going to be completely this color that you can see in the background. Now, with a minimum setting, that means that the distance between the 0 and 2 is going to be whatever that is. And this is between 0 and 1, I believe. So at 0, it's obviously no effect. And at 1, every single mesh everywhere will be just completely mystified, so to speak. And the height option is not something that I've really found much effect with, but it's the tooltip tells us that it's going to control how much mist density decreases with height. So you would expect that something's going to, maybe it would be just ground fog or something like that. The fall off is how the intensity of the fog ramps up over the distance, how it's interpolated. I've gone for quadratic, which is a physically correct fall off for lighting, and I think it looks pretty good here with the fog too. So that's the mist setting, extremely quick to set up. You may actually notice that as you set something differently, so for example if we set this to say 10, it might actually take a little bit of time to just update the view so that you can see the effects. And as you can see here, nothing is kicked in just yet. And there we go, it's now brought that in for us. But I'm just going to set that back to 2. Something else that will help inform the mood of the art is the shadowing. Preferably we could do with seeing some shadows without having to stop and perform light map. That is to say, avoiding baking in the lighting into a separate texture that is then added to all the materials. So setting up the viewport shadows will be our second tip. Now in this scene it's pretty straightforward. You can see I've got this lamp right here, which you can see is casting these sorts of shadows. You can see from the wood planks leaning up against the wall that we get these various different shadows there. And this particular little sample street has got these 4 spot lamps. In fact, these are instances. I think if we go up to the top of the data panel here, we can see the number 4 there, meaning if I change anything on here like the size, you can see all 4 of them should change. So I'll just set that back to 90. This is one of the values that I've changed from default, by the way, along with the blend here. That is, I've turned this all the way up to 1. Otherwise, you get quite a sharp fall off to it like that. So I'm going to crank that back up to 1. And otherwise, I've changed the color using the swatch and just cranked up the energy to 15. Now that's all fairly straightforward. I think you might hit a limit about the amount of these lamps that you can have in the scene, but I'll let you know when I hit that limit. But otherwise, this should be fairly straightforward for us in here. I would probably like to have a directional light or a sun lamp, sort of acting as the moon though in this case. And so there's something to bear in mind about that type of light, which I'd just like to point out. So I'm just going to switch over to another basic scene, which is this one. And in here, you can see I've already created this sun lamp, or directional light as it's sometimes called. Now this basically means that it's some kind of infinity light. So it's kind of imagined as though it's some sort of infinity point away, and then it casts these perfectly parallel shadows from an extremely far away object like the sun and the moon, that you would get these types of shadows, as opposed to the spot lamp, which you can see here has this type of shadow which is flaring out on the object. And so if we actually move that further and further away, you should see the shadow starts to come in and align and to be a little bit more like this directional light here. So I guess our sun or the moon, any shadows created from that probably do have an ever so slight flaring to them, but for all intents and purposes, I don't think anyone's going to really be able to tell. So I can delete that lamp because we don't need it anymore. But something that you probably might notice is there's something strange about this scene, which is just this plane with these 4 cubes on it, basically casting shadows. This is set to cast shadows, but you can see it's not actually casting any shadow on this one, yet it is lighting this cube. So that's a kind of a fundamental thing to note about this sort of light, is that the placement of the light shouldn't really make any difference, or at least it shouldn't make any difference for the lighting. However, it does for the shadows. So that's worth bearing in mind. So as you can see that it's pointing this way and it's actually placed in front of this light, it's not going to include this in its shadow calculation. So to be able to include it in the calculation, we just need to move it off to the side. And as I do that, you can see now that we've got this shadow showing up. Now there is something else which is worth noting, is that if we actually bring it further and further and further away, you can see now the one at the the furthest away one is now starting to lose its shadow. So there is obviously a kind of a clipping distance there. If we come down at the bottom here, you can see these are our basic settings. We've not got very much to play with right now. If I, of course, move this lamp right over to the other side, you can see all the shadows go away. So let me just place it back there. Now the setting for this, and this is why I kind of wanted to bring this up, is kind of a little bit hidden. All we need to do is just switch over from Blender Render to Blender Game and then watch what happens over here. You can see we get a different kind of set of controls, and the one that we need is not the clipping. The clipping isn't going to affect this. However, if I do bring this right down, you can see that it is actually going to start to clip it and reduce it within its frame of influence that it has right now. But if we take this right up to 40, maybe 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and so on and so on and so on, you can see this cube is still not being included. So what's up with that? What we need is the frustum size. So all we need to do is, say if I bring that down, let's see what happens. You can see it's actually starting to behave similar to that clipping value. If we actually take it right up, you can see, if we just keep watching that faraway cube, there it comes, and we've now got the shadow taking effect there. So it's this value that we need to keep our eye on. What you might notice as well is that the resolution of the shadow isn't particularly great. You get this stepping, this aliasing that's going on. That's to do with the quality size. You might want to change that to 1024 or perhaps 2048, depending on the strength of your graphics card, I believe. So I'm going to set that to 1024 for now, because that should do for any viewport shadows that we kind of really need to be able to see what's going on with. The other thing is that you get in a very dark shadow, you don't really get much of a bounce. So bounce lighting that kind of fills in these shadows. So something that might help with that is just to lessen the amount of shadow that we're getting there. And so I'm just going to pull that back and just lighten that up a little bit, and just to get what I feel is maybe a slightly more realistic shadowing. The other thing is, you can see that this is slightly detached from the beginning of where the cube actually should be casting, and we can use our bias to help with this. So if we just turn that up, you can see it's gone even further away, and then if we actually bring it right down, we can sort of attach it to the mesh itself. The problem with that is that we're now kind of getting this banding, so we might like to try and just filter in some of the other settings. But to be honest, the best thing I've found is maybe holding shift and sliding down this particular slider, so you get a fine-tuned control of exactly where you might want this. I'm going to just settle with about there at 0.5. And that's it. There's just a few things to just bear in mind with the real-time shadows when working within the 3D view. The third tip is to get our textures that rely on an alpha channel to display their outlines properly. Sometimes they can struggle a little to show up cleanly, and this is something that goes away if we press P for the play mode. As you can see there, the highlighting, kind of the glowing edge almost to this particular decal goes away. And you can see if I press Z to toggle into wireframe, they're just sort of quads with this image texture on there. So if I just press Alt Z to go back to textured view, just to show you this image a little bit clearer, I'll just pull it down in the preview window, which is a cool thing that you can do in Blender now, just to give as much space as you want to these texture preview slots. You can see the black color represents the fully transparent in this particular image, or we can hit the show alpha checkbox there and you can have that displayed and represented as this checker pattern instead. And you can kind of see in the alpha channel where we can actually see the image there, that will be completely white, and where it's completely transparent it'll be completely black. And it's at this point where these two kind of meet that we're getting this weird kind of highlighting occur in the diffuse rather than the alpha channel. So that's kind of a strange thing that's going on there, which there's a few things that we can do to rectify. So one of the things that we can do is, of course, press P to enter the play mode, but that's not necessarily that ideal. And another thing is, if we actually select this mesh, you can see that the strange highlighting has now gone. If we uncheck outline selected in the properties sidebar, you can see that allows it to show up a little bit clearer again, because we're obviously replacing the glowing highlight with another kind of an outline. And you'll notice that that was green because I've placed all these in a group, and with Control G, and that means that we can then go Shift G to select the group, and then it's a way of quickly selecting all those decals or any decals that you would like. Another option there, by the way, is in this, depending on how complicated the scene is, you could actually just go Shift L and then select the linked materials, and that would essentially do the same thing. There is something else that we can do, by the way, which I suppose we could just have outline selected on, and if we wanted to just quickly go only render, that's another way of being able to do it. Of course, we would need those selected, so I'll just go Shift L and then material in this case. So that's fine, so we could just toggle it on and off there, or we could just uncheck that and then carry on as we would. Another thing to note about this, if I just switch this window to a user preferences and then come over to the system tab within there, we can see that we've got mipmaps here, and I'll just press A to deselect everything, and then unchecking mipmaps sort of cleans things up a little bit, but you get a very, very pixelated view in the distance there. So mipmaps do look a lot cleaner. So I like to keep those on. But we do have this clip alpha setting, which if we just start to crank that up, you can see kind of tends to mitigate the problem slightly. Somewhere around 0.5 looks like it's probably okay. Now basically what's happening here is that 0 is black and 1 is fully opaque and white, and somewhere in the middle would be mid-grey. You know, you'd be able to see a little bit of the diffuse of the texture, and you'd be able to see a lot of what was through it as well, what was on the other side of that, like glass, or depending on how frosted that glass is, say. But in this case, what's happening is any textures in the scene or any materials set to be 0.513 and below, it's just treating them as though they're pure black. So anything, so this is the new scale from 0.5 to 1. Everything 0.5 and below is just going to get clipped to black. That's something to demonstrate there is if we just come over to this window over here, you can see we kind of got this bit of window pane there. If I come over to the properties, in fact we're going to need another window here. If I go over to the properties there, switch the outliner over, and then you can see this is the material that this glass is using. And if we just come down to the transparency setting, you can see Z transparency, and it's set to 0.667. As soon as this clip alpha comes to 0.667, you can see it basically just clips it entirely and treats it as black. And so that's worth bearing in mind if you're going to kind of use that method. And that's it on the alpha channel. Our fourth tip, and one of the most handiest parts of Blender, is that it has a really cool navigation option that we can initiate with the shortcut Shift F. So if I just press Shift F now, you can see that we can now use the mouse to sort of look around as though it's like a game. This basically means that we don't need to go in and code anything. We can very, very quickly just press Shift F, and we're now immediately in this kind of first person view. Now you can press W, A, S and D, and then we can move around. The problem at the moment is that we're sort of just flying up and around. If you don't want that behavior and you want it kind of like you're walking through the scene, you can actually do that by just pressing tab, and then that kind of gives everything some temporary collision, I guess based on bounding boxes or something. For this to work properly, you will kind of need to be set to the right kind of scale. So that means currently I'm using the idea that one blender unit is about 1 meter, and this camera places us above about 2 units. The way that the collision works is that it's kind of thinking that your feet are kind of 2 units below the camera, which is kind of like about 2 meters, or maybe something slightly lower than that, sort of like a human figure kind of size. So if you've got the scale well off, you might find you're standing and then looking maybe up this top tier up here, but as it stands at the moment, we're just kind of looking down here. And there's a few more options that you may be able to see in the header of the 3D view. Left mouse button will confirm and move the camera view to the current view and exit the tool. Right mouse or escape will cancel, and the camera view will jump back to what it was before you entered the tool. The tab is for the gravity, which is currently on. WAS and D is to move around, and we can press shift to suddenly kind of start running if you like. The alt, it will take us really slow. We've got Q and E, which will move us straight up and down. Now the only other thing that I really need to look at is maybe the fact that we've got this jump that we can do here, so which is with the V key. And also if we want to suddenly zoom over to this area, we can by pressing middle mouse button, and you can see we just quickly teleported right there. And we can just do that going straight back again. So that's that navigation method. Really handy. Doesn't need us to go in and add any logic bricks at this stage or mouse scripts. It allows us just to very quickly just get a good feel and kind of roam around our level straight away. Our fifth and final tip for now is for the reflections in the windows. We don't need a cube map at this stage. Let me just find a window here. So here's one. So you can see you're kind of getting a reflection happening in there. Now you don't actually need a cube map, which you might need, which you would be used to using in a typical game engine. We can actually just use reflection coordinates to give the impression of a cube map. So if I just press Shift Space to minimize that back again, and then switch that over to the properties again. And if we just come over to the material, we can see if we select this one, it's got a whole bunch of materials on, but this material is the one that we want. And all I've got here is, this is all pretty much standard. I've actually just given it a little bit of transparency on the Z transparency there. And now if we just go over to the texture slot, you can see I've got this specular image, but that's not particularly doing much at the moment. The main thing that we need to look at is this texture slot right here. This is the grunge texture that I've added, and it just looks a little bit like that. Now a bit further down you can see I've actually just set this to the coordinates for reflection. If it's set to say UV, then you kind of get that kind of thing, not very much. And then if we set to the reflection, you kind of get that reflection. And the color value can be reduced down from 1 as usual to lessen how much the texture shows, and in this case makes the reflection subtler and less like a full-on mirror. So there's some quick tips for getting some decent results quite quickly when iterating through some layout ideas in Blender, especially if you have an asset pack to work with that you've already built up. And I'm using basically this one that you can see over lined up over here from the recently released DVD. And in it we have this bridge mesh, which we come to again, and that will be ideal for breaking up the level by extending it across the central area. And there's only a few things we need to do to have it useful and fit for purpose, so let's get it ready. So to give us a little bit more space in the 3D view, I'll close out these sidebars. So I'll press N on to close the property sidebar and T to close the tool shelf. And then also I'll press Shift D just to duplicate this bridge mesh and put it out into the open there so that we can work on it without getting distracted by any of the other meshes there. And then I'll press Alt Z to take a look in textured mode, and everything still seems to be showing up okay. Now basically I want this to tile along the X axis, so this way. And there's a very easy way to create these extra instances. It's just by coming over to the modifiers tab in the properties window and then adding an array modifier, and then by default it's set to the x-axis, 1 on the x-axis, and it's a relative offset, which is exactly what we need because we don't want to specify a certain amount of blender units or anything. We just want it to start again at the extents of the edges of this mesh. Now the problem with that is that we're getting this large gap. I'm just going to press shift space just to expand the view slightly more, and then press 7 on the numpad to take a look from top view, and then Z to toggle our wireframe. Now the extent of our bounding box is actually this edge here, so what we need to do is just to bring in these edges a little bit. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, press Control Tab to bring up the mesh select mode at the location of the cursor, make sure that we're on vertices, and then I'm going to press A to deselect everything, and then B to border select across those verts. And then what we can do is I want to now move these in, and then you can see that the location of the array, the next version of the mesh in the array, is starting to move thanks to us changing these vertices, the edge of the bounding box basically. So what I'll do is I'll just make sure that we're on vertex snapping, and then press, because I'd like to align it to these vertices here, so I'm going to press G and then X to constrain it along the x-axis, and then hold Control. I can then choose a vertex to snap it against, and then you can see that it's all constrained along the x-axis there, so it's aligned them nicely. And then I'll press A to deselect these, and then press B to highlight these, because I'd like to shift these verts on these beams over as well. So I'll press G and then X and then Control and then gesture towards them, and then that's that side done. Now press A to deselect those, and then we just tuck these in as well. So I'll press B and G, X, hold Control and then gesture towards one of those vertices, and then again press A to deselect everything, and then B to get these, and then press G, X, and then hold Control to gesture towards those, and now that should be completely fine. The problem is that there is a slight black mark down the center of where it's actually tiling there, and the reason for that is because it's was never designed necessarily to tile like this, and so there's a slight occlusion mark there, but I think that can be easily taken out of the diffuse texture if necessary, or just cloned out anyway. So the next thing to do is to add a curve for which this to be deformed along, just so that we can dictate its shape quite easily. So I'll press Shift A to add in a curve Bezier. I'm also going to do this from the top view, so I'm going to press 7 on the numpad. I'll just move that around here or so, and then with this selected, I'll press G and then just move that way over there. I'll press E to extrude that out there. I'll also just change all these handle types by pressing A to make sure we have all of them selected, and then press V and then set the handle types to automatic, and that way we kind of get a much more smoother interpolation automatically between those points. That looks fine to me, so I'll leave that as it is. All we need to do then is just select the mesh itself and then shift select the curve, press Ctrl P to set the parent to curve deform. Now basically this will add a modifier on the mesh, which is going to be a curve modifier there at the bottom there, and it's going to set the curve to that, and it's on the x-axis, so this should all work quite easily. And then what we can do is just set the array to several more points. Now it's actually going the wrong way, so we could either rotate the mesh around, or we can just set this to -1 instead, and then set the count up maybe to about 7. And now we can see that the curve actually starts around here. So I'm going to, with the mesh selected, I'm just going to press G and then X to constrain it along the x-axis and just move that slightly back like so. And then that should be fine. And also we can select the mesh and then press G and then Y just to center it a little bit on the curve there. So that's pretty much okay. Now that when we select the curve, I'll do this again from top view, we can start to move things around. You can see that this kind of conforms to wherever we want it to go, but the mesh is not quite perfect yet. We basically need to add a little bit more geometry, because you can probably see that there are parts of the mesh which is kind of sticking out there, and they shouldn't be like that. So we need a little bit more curvature to everything. So I'll press tab on to bring ourselves back into edit mode, and then I'll add extra loops along these large faces here by pressing Control R, and then I'll scroll the middle mouse wheel, so we've got 3 cuts along there, and then press left to confirm, and then without moving the mouse, because we'll start sliding them otherwise, we need to press the left mouse again just to drop out of the tool and have them perfectly into position. And I'll just press Z just to get into wireframe. Press Z to, again actually, and I'll go to textured solid mode. And then press Control R, and then do that to the other side, just these 3 loop cuts, and then double click to just confirm at the end there so we don't slide. And then that's that sorted. The next thing I'd like to do is to just grab, I'll just press Control Tab to bring up the mesh select mode at the location of the cursor, and then select face, and then just select all these sort of rail line type struts here, and just a face from each, and then press Control L to select all the linked faces. And then what I'll do is I'll press Shift H to hide everything in the mesh, so that we're just looking at those. And now basically we want to just go through these, and I'll press Shift Space to maximize the view just to give us a little bit more space again, and then I'll press Control R, and then maybe 4 cuts on each. So let's just go through and duplicate that. I'll just do this in wireframe. Now in wireframe mode we can actually see a ghost of the array, so I'm just going to switch that off again for a second, and then press Control R, and then again 4 cuts, and then again I'll just duplicate this all the way along. Okay, now that's all of them done. Now I'll just press Alt H just to bring everything back there, and then bring the array back on. So, and also Alt Z to bring us back into textured mode, and then tab out of edit mode back into object mode, and we can see everything should sort of fit much better now. Everything should conform along that curve a lot more nicely. So one final thing is that this is obviously just floating in space at the moment, so I'm going to press Z to come into wireframe and then take a look at this beam that comes with it. I'll just duplicate this with Shift D and then Shift Z just to constrain it along that plane, and then so that it's not going to move up or down on the Z axis, and then just bring that over to the mesh. I'll press R to rotate it, and then X, and then 90 just to stand it up like that, and then I'll lower this down slightly. Let's work out exactly how high this should go. So G and then Z to bring that down to maybe about there, and then from top view I'll press Z to toggle into the wireframe so we can see what we're doing. I'll actually just place these manually. I suppose we could have attached these to the mesh so that it would be duplicating as well, but I kind of don't want quite as many of these sort of support beams as there are versions of this mesh. So I'm actually going to just bring this over here, rotate it around so it sort of aligns, and then duplicate, and then bring that there. So, and now I'll select those 2, and then I'll place another one maybe around here. So Shift D and bring them to about there. So that looks about right. And then Shift D and then press R to rotate them around, and then maybe place them about there. And then you get the idea. So let's just press Alt Z to just see how that's looking now. And that's fine. I would actually add, maybe, I'm not actually too sure what I'm going to do with the bottoms here. I'll probably have them go into some sort of concrete base as it touches down on into the rest of the model, the level once it's created. But that's basically how to kind of set up and remodify that bridge asset to be able to take any form and shape that you kind of need. So with that, that's it for this installment, and in the next video I'll be dealing with the topic of modularity and how this will help assemble the level pretty quickly, at least for a first pass anyway. So I hope you'll join me next time, and thanks for watching, and bye for now.